This is not the beginning of the program. Zach, can you bring me up just a little? This is not the beginning of the program. This is your 5-minute warning. Isn't it nice to be in a literary space where they say they're going to start on time and you get a 5-minute warning? The answer is yes, it is very nice to be in a space like that. Go ahead, say yes, it is. Yes, thank you. What was the question? There are seats up front, first row. It's not reserved. There are seats. It'd be crazy for you not to sit up front. We also have bench seating. We have this is what we call the facing bench. It's very Quakerish. We have a seat right here. We have seats. We can handle, we can handle some people in the living room. We've got a big screen out there, but we hope to fill the space in here first. So we're going to start in 4 minutes. Hey, buddy. How are you? Yes. Molly, sit in the front. There's one more seat in the front. And now there's a seat in the third row. Going once, going twice. A seat in the third row seat. And we'll begin in 3 minutes. Paging Emily Reardon. Emily Reardon, are you here? Paging Emily Reardon. Yeah, she's not here yet. You got quiet. You still have 1 minute. Really, it's raining. People are slow. Talk among yourselves. 1 minute.
Are we allowed to take photos?
Yes, photos are. Great. But you should know that everything's being recorded and you can watch it later. Yeah. Yeah. Paul. Yeah, 30 seconds. How many of you would be known as FOP, Friends of Paul? Of course, that's everybody. How many of you are PFOP, Prospective Friends of Paul? How many of you are former students of Paul? Can we give the former students of Paul a big hand for coming back to hang out with us? And how many of you are faculty colleagues of Paul Hendrickson? Greg, get your hand up. How many of you are retired faculty colleagues of Paul? Okay, there's a lot of people here. Thank you, welcome. We are here to celebrate Paul and this remarkable book that I finished 2 nights ago. Oh, it's amazing, Plagued by Fire. Couple of housekeeping things, and then I have a few words of introduction, and then Paul's got a presentation that's going to end with Q&A. And after that, we have, I guess it's Writer's House style plus. We went all out for a reception. So we have very yummy food. I believe we have alcoholic beverages. I'm going to say wine. Wine, lots and lots of wine. And we're not sure about this. It's going to be improvised, but there's going to be a point where we're all standing around celebrating Paul after this program, and enough of us will be holding glasses. And so somebody, probably me, will raise a glass and make a toast to Paul. That will be the time to do that. And then maybe there are other toasts that follow from former students and FOPs and PFOPs, because the PFOPs by that point will be FOPs. Yes, and since I'm raising my glass of water, this is the time not to toast, but to put our hands together at the start of the program for Paul Hendrickson. We have copies of the book for sale, and if you scurried and bought a copy, you could read from the hymnal, as I imagine Paul will be reading from it, but you could always check the page numbers and then catch up from the hymnal later. Somehow through Writer's House sleight of hand, because we are a nonprofit organization, and that's for sure, we were able to sell the book. Oh, hey guys, come on in. There are seats. There's no sense in standing in the door. There are seats, and even if you have to be sort of in the living room, you can see everything. Really, you don't have to stand. They're all standing out there. We have copies of this book. We're selling it. Shh, are the Knopf people here yet? We're late on the train, but she won't care. We are selling this book. Is that Emily? Hi. Emily, hi. Can we thank Knopf in the form of Emily for publishing this book? Emily, put your fingers in your ears, please. Trust me. My name is Al. Put your fingers in your ears. We're selling this book for $25. It will cost you probably $42 elsewhere. So you're going to fall in love with it. We could have sold it for $100 and you would buy it, but it's $25. And I have a feeling that Paul will be willing to inscribe it for you at the end. This is an amazing book. Wright is an amazing, fascinating, utterly fascinating person. But that's not sufficient, because Paul Hendrickson is an utterly fascinating person. And the two of them together make for a reading experience that is rare and true. And I mean true in the Hendricksonian sense of true. The truth that you get when you are an obsessive reporter. I mean, here in the academy, we typically will say researcher or scholar. I think Paul prefers the term reporter. He uses the verb reporting. It's a deeply scholarly experience. It is reporting. And true, rare, definitely what he's done. It's Paul Hendrickson, the eminent obsessive reporter. And I mean obsessive in the most positive sense. The obsessive reporter meets a challenge, not just Wright, who's a very slippery character, as you'll find out when you read the book, but also the story that's been told so many times that everyone, including your editor, must have said, why the hell do you want to write about Frank Lloyd Wright? There's been so much written about it. And that is the point. The point is that Paul Hendrickson fits this scene, not just the Writer's House, but the University of Pennsylvania, any university, and certainly literary studies, for the following reason. We are not in literary studies because of what a book says. I mean, that's important. We are not in literary studies because of the weight of content that gets delivered through the vehicle known as the book or the poem or the play or the text. We are in it because how what is said is more important than what is said. And this is a book about how. And the only way that Paul Hendrickson was able to make a new story of this old story was to focus on not just the how of Wright, but the how of this reporter in the 20-teens. How long did it take to write this book? 7 years. So the 20-teens, the entirety of it, basically, to find out the how. How Hendrickson goes and gets the story is not something that is hidden behind this book. It is in the book. It is crucially part of the book. As you read the book, you're trying to get to Wright, but you have to go through Hendrickson to get to Wright. And Hendrickson is a good guide. He's saying, by the way, this little piece of information seems important. Ignore it for now. Or this information, let me tell you how I found out that piece of information. And 5 pages later, you thought you would be bored by Hendrickson finding it out, and you realize that he went on an adventure, and he did all the work for you, so you didn't have to go to Tulsa 4 times, and you didn't have to call some guy in Los Angeles whom you'd never met. You didn't have to do any of that. He's done it for you, and you still feel sweaty and drained. You still feel like you built a bunch of impossible to build buildings. So I want to end this introduction by giving you 2 examples of the how at work, and then I'm going to turn the podium over to Paul. The first example marks the moment as I was reading this book, and you could almost call it reading it on assignment. Paul is a colleague and a friend, and I was going to do an introduction. And so I thought, okay, I have this big book, a lot of pages. I thought, well, how am I going to get through this? This is a big book. Here's where he had me. The whole story of young Wright's arrival in Chicago makes up many pages in the beginning of the book. When did he come? How did he come? What did he do? It turns out that, I'm sure Paul will have much more to say about this, Wright is a myth maker. And so there's, even though everybody's written about this, the fact is that we don't really know a lot of it. So Paul figures it out. And he tracks the guy off the train on that day. And he asks a question. Did he really get off the train on that late summer day, on that particular day in the fall of 1886? And he describes himself as going to see a performance of a ballet at a gilt opera house on a Wednesday evening, and it rained. Most of us, Paul would have given up and said, I guess that's true. Or maybe it's not true, but Paul had to figure it out. So he went to the calendars, he figured out which are the Wednesdays, he checked out the weather. It turns out it could only be one Wednesday if, in fact, it was a Wednesday at all. And you're exhausted, and you read on. And then you find out there's a guy named Thomas S. Hines, Jr., who many years earlier in the 1960s, who was writing a story. Is it for a newspaper or for the University Archives?
It was for Wisconsin Magazine of History.
So he was writing for the...
It was in the University Archives.
So he's a university archivist writing for the University Magazine. And Paul found this piece in which this guy, Hines, discovered that Wright made a whole lot of things up about his time at the University of Wisconsin. He didn't really go for many semesters at all. And what did Paul do? He found this guy Hines 60 years later, found him in Los Angeles, and talked to him. And the book you are going to read after this evening has a full account of the conversation between Paul Hendrickson and Thomas S. Hines, Jr. And Paul actually asks at that moment, why does all this matter? And he doesn't really answer it, but you've answered it for yourself because you're still reading. My second and final example of the brilliant how of this book. There is an essay on sources. Knopf knew that they had to make it in tinier print because it's at the end of the book and it's long. It's like 50 pages in tiny print. I've never read anything like this. I've read a lot of books. It's called an essay on sources, but it's really a personal essay. It's like a personal bibliographical essay. Let me read you a sentence from it. This is a bibliographical essay, mind you. Just one more try to square the unsquarable. I've walked the upstairs and downstairs of Tanidiri trying to imagine. Or another example. Finally, this is a bibliographical essay, so don't try this at home, dissertation writers. Finally, squaring it all back home. Irony is where you find it, or take it. There was no room to go into this in the text, and there is hardly any room for it here. And it could make its own separate story, but in my 5 reporting trips to Tulsa, over 3 years, I had met or talked on the phone to a number of, and so on and so forth. So you get to the end of the Wright story, and you realize that this is the story about an indefatigable, brilliant researcher whose subjectivity is completely in the work. And you realize that you've gone on a journey with Paul Hendrickson to figure out, arguably, the great architect of the 20th century. It's quite a twosome. Unfortunately, Wright is not here tonight to talk to you, but Paul Hendrickson is. Paul Hendrickson.
Do you know what I just whispered to Al? In some cases, I should just say thank you and sit down. He said an awful lot of it. Thank you very much. And we are starting a little bit late, and Al said in the other room, he said, because we always like to have these programs last about an hour, and I've certainly been involved in a number of them over the years. This might go a bit longer than, just a little bit longer than the hour, because I am standing in front of you at 6:15, but I am going to take off my watch, and we will have room and time for questions, which is probably the best part of all this anyway. I'm surprised that so many of you found your way here in this pelting rain. Thank you very much. I know that was an extra effort. Even before I start talking about Wright, the king of tangents, as my editor calls me, I have to go off script just a little. You'll allow me to do this, and then I promise I'll get to the subject at hand. Why do I want to go off script? I want to say some heartfelt, if clunky, thank yous to some special people. I don't know when exactly I might get another chance. I look out and I really see so many faces, some going back many, many years. I speak of the kids so affectionately. One right here on my left, no longer a kid, but she was in class 15 years ago. I don't remember, and she got down here from New York. Elaine, bless you. Even some old newspaper friends from way back in another life are here in the audience. And some neighbors, some Starbucks friends at my local Starbucks out in the suburbs. You somehow made it here. Bless you. And my colleagues from across the university, not least from the English department, but from some other departments as well. Some crucial librarians from Van Pelt and Fisher Fine Arts who helped me get through all this. I'm grateful for all of, speaking of colleagues and staff, of what I kind of call hallway friendships. I'm just very grateful. While I'm in the gratitude department, my wife, my partner of 41 years, Cecilia Hendrickson, we were driving down here, and I said, nobody's going to be there, the terrible rain. Why don't we send out an all points bulletin and just say we're canceling? And I was driving. She put her hand on my knee, and she said, it will be fine. Yeah. If anybody knows the cost of these books, it is the partner. Down in my office at Fisher Bennett, there is a T-shirt hanging. We could walk down there, and I could prove it and show it to you tonight. Seal got it made for me. We've been together 43 years, married 41, so somewhere about 38 years ago, she got it made for me. And here's what it says. It was when I was struggling to write my first book. I didn't know how to write a book, and the T-shirt said, "Caution, book in progress." You know what she calls these projects? Sister wives. And yet she's always the first to encourage me, no matter the huge cost, to start thinking about the next. In the second book I wrote, I have unfortunately lost that T-shirt. She upped the ante. That one said, just say no to books. Emily Reardon just came in. She is a key person at the publisher at Knopf, a publicist who's far, far more than a publicist, and she had to change trains because trains were canceling in Trenton, but she's here. Aren't you somewhere? Thank God, Emily. My editor, if I have been married 41 years, I've been with the same book editor for 40 years. That never happens in the revolving door of journalism. That man's name is Jonathan Segal. He's in France right now. He may be tuning it in on online streaming for the Writer's House. I certainly told him about it 2 weeks ago when we had our first event at what I think of as my home bookstore in Washington, D.C., Politics and Prose. He came down. He rode the Acela down. So in 1983, which is 36 years ago, he and I together published my first book. It's called Seminary. It's Seminary, a Search. It's a reported memoir of my time in a way, way other life back beyond a distant moon when I was a student for the priesthood. I'm still in the gratitude department, so I need to say something about this beautiful little building. This gorgeous building, which has been extended, as you know, but they kept the spirit of it so beautifully, trimmed in green wood, sitting back from the walk. This little jewel, which you feel you could almost nest in the palm of your hand at this huge pre-professional university, has always represented for me a kind of true north. There has not been a single term since 1998, which was the first spring semester I taught here, when I was riding a train up one day a week and still keeping my seat at the Washington Post. There has not been a single term that I have taught here that I haven't taught in this building, in one of the rooms upstairs, right above us or down the hall. So true north. In fact, the first time I ever saw this building was a year before 1998. It was in the spring of 1997. My wife and I were coming back from New York. We were up there. I was a finalist in an award that I did not win. It was the New York Public Library Literary Journalist Award. I was a finalist, but I didn't win. The week before, or 2 weeks before, I had written a letter, totally wrong kind of letter, to the then chairman of the English department, Wendy Steiner, and her undergraduate chair, Lisa New. I didn't send a CV because I didn't have a CV. I was just an ink-stained wretch from the Washington Post. But they invited me. They said, yes, come and see us, come and talk to us. So I did. I hopped off the train, and we were living in Washington. Seal went on to Washington. I got off. I had a wonderful lunch at the White Dog with Wendy and Lisa and Peter Kahn. And then afterward, Greg Janickian, who was director of creative writing, walked me up Locust Walk to see Writer's House, my first glimpse of it. Greg walks very fast. I was trying to keep up with him. He told me he was a poet, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't know your poetry. What is the name or the title of one of your books? And he said, well, one of them is called Falling Deeply into America. And I remember almost stopping on the walk, stopping our very fast and saying, gosh, what a beautiful title that is. But you know, I was secretly thinking, I have since figured out, maybe I could fall deeply into the University of Pennsylvania. And somehow that happened to me. I was 53 years old then. I was certainly in deep middle age. In my experience, people very, very rarely get to go from one world-class institution to another. And it happened to me. I'll never be a true academic, and that's quite obvious. I came to all this, as I said, very late, after 30 years, glad years, as toiling in the groves of journalism, but knew I needed to do something else. And this place happened to me. I was a stranger, and you took me in. And I am utterly grateful. But of course, when I say this building and true north of this building, I am really speaking, aren't I, of the people? I mean Al, who just made that eloquent introduction, who is the thrumming heartbeat of all this, and Julia, and Jessica, and Mingo, and I don't need to say their last names. So many of you in here know who these people are, and all of the others, including Zach, who's doing the audio-visual, who week in, week out make this place just tick alive. Yes, of course, tensions and misunderstandings sometimes break out and boil over, but isn't that part of just being a family? I take particular comfort in the historical fact that Kelly Ryder's house was once the residence of the university chaplain. In a book that I used to know pretty well in a former life, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." It sort of all fits. I have long felt that when we are at our best as students and teachers, something almost holy goes on within these walls, and I'm willing to take out the almost. I say that as someone who doesn't think of himself as particularly religious any longer. Let me reference the man I'm supposed to be talking to you about tonight, and will in half a second. In the last interview he ever gave, two days before he died, Frank Lloyd Wright said, quote, "If there were no spiritual quality in architecture, it would just be plain lumber." So I say, if there weren't something of that same feeling and quality here within these walls, then wouldn't it just be nouns and verbs? I suppose that is the real way I am trying to say thank you. If my editor, the man I mentioned, Jonathan Segal, who's in France, were here, he would be silently mouthing over in the corner, "Paul, get on with the damn thing." So I will now get on with the damn thing. I'm definitely not going to read from the text. I have what I think of as a stump speech. It's got a shorter version and a longer version. This will be the in-between version because of where we're starting and because of where we want some questions to come forth. I just saw my beautiful friend Linda Patterson Miller, one of the eminent Hemingway scholars in the nation. She's here with her husband. Hello, Linda. So I will talk for 20 minutes about what I hope this book is trying to be. It might suggest the arc of the story, and then if there's any questions. I actually have an audience plant, so I know there will be one question. Hold that. So thank you. The book I worked on for something like 7 years, and that took me from Fifth Avenue and East 88th in Manhattan, where the Guggenheim Museum is, to Spring Green, Wisconsin, to Bear Run, Pennsylvania, where falling water thrusts itself right out from rock face, to Kansas and California and a whole lot of other places in between, was never meant to be a cradle-to-grave, conventional Frank Lloyd Wright biography. You could say, I don't know how to do those, and besides, there are already too many. Rather, what I was trying for from the start was something I have attempted before in books: find storytelling pockets in a life that might somehow stand for the oceanic whole of that life. There is a Latin word I recall from my seminary days, synecdoche, a Latin figure of speech, part for the whole, the festering grain of sand hidden inside the half-buried oyster. The aim was to go roughly in a chronological direction and arc from east to west. From June 8th, 1867, when Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin, to April 9th, 1959, when Frank Lloyd Wright died in his sleep after a hospitalization and risky abdominal surgery in Phoenix, Arizona. Even though he was in his hospital bedclothes, I like to picture him there at the last at 4:45 a.m. that Thursday, St. Joseph's Hospital, the great silver-haired dandy with the swept side bangs, so vain about his dress as he was about everything else in life, fitted out and all set to go in his rolled brim pork pie hat and Dracula cape and those goofy pants, almost pantaloons, pegged at the ankles. The legend is he just sighed and floated off on the coolish air of that fine desert morning. Frank Lloyd Wright, born 2 years after the end of the Civil War, dead not quite 2 years after the launch of Sputnik. 91 years and 10 months on the earth. Poof, perfect, gone. But possibly not before he had slipped into the left side pocket of his jacket one of his soft black drafting pencils, along with a pocket knife for sharpening it, so that he might polish off a drawing or two in heaven. Nothing so seductive in this life, he once said, than the prospect of sitting down to a blank piece of saffron-colored onion skin paper with a stubby, coal-black, newly sharpened, soft-leaded pencil. There is no being lonesome after that, he once said. It's almost hard to imagine, but in the last decade of his life, he designed nearly a third of his total output. He just kept rising and going to his tilted board with his T-square, triangle, and scale, with his fading eyesight and periodic inner ear disorder that could make him so dizzy and nauseous he would have to crawl around on all fours like a blind man. This is what it means to be an artist, to seize this essence brooding everywhere in everything, just behind aspect, he once said, beautifully, mysteriously, Wrightianly. In 1991, the journal Architectural Record published a list of the 100 most important buildings of the 20th century. 12 of his were on it. Had he been alive, he would have demanded a recount, I'm pretty sure. His roofs were legendary for leaking. Why wouldn't they have leaked? He was always pushing the limits of materials, straining against the form. I don't build a house without predicting the end of the present social order, he once announced grandly. He liked letting himself into his houses to begin rearranging the furniture while the owners were out, putting their ghastly trinkets in bottom drawers. Like Thoreau, like Jesus, he thought too many material possessions were an unhealthy thing, possibly the only thing he had in common with Jesus. One of his lifelong dictums was that his buildings were like plants and trees growing upward, in effect, from the inside out, emerging spanking wet and blinking their eyes to the world. It was part of his gospel of organic architecture, even if his definition of those two words were always shifting around like verbal tectonic plates and sometimes seemed to mystify even him. He just needed to conceive the thing, draw the thing, make the thing. The thing had simply shaken itself out of my sleeve, the old shaman liked to say. In a 72-year career as an architect and an egotist, he shook more than 1,100 things from his sleeve, a nearly incredulous number by any artistic measurement. They were churches, schools, offices, banks, museums, hotels, medical clinics, an automobile showroom, a synagogue, a mile-high skyscraper, and one very strange-looking Phillips 66 gas station in Cloquet, Minnesota. Overwhelmingly, though, they were houses, residences, shelters for mankind. And by that fact alone, I wonder if it isn't possible to start thinking of this supreme artist and insufferable man through a slightly different and softer lens. He wished to create dignified human spaces that would be around long after he was not. I have been in several score of those spaces, and there are certain moments, if the light is falling right, when it will begin to seem as if Whitman is singing to Emerson or vice versa, channeled through an ego that could see both of theirs in the great stakes game of fame and self-love and raise you by half. There are also moments when what comes, as others before me have said, is the wonder of a religious feeling. Taliesin at tiny Spring Green, Wisconsin, where my wife and I are going this Saturday night. It was Wright's own home and the place where he lived longer than anywhere else. In Welsh, the word means shining brow. He built it into the not quite top of a green hill overlooking a looping bend in the Wisconsin River. Everywhere in this house there is wood, especially cypress, giving the interior, the more so in the lamplit evenings, a kind of pumpkin gleam. This hill and this valley were Wright's ancestral country on his maternal side, and he had known it and loved it since boyhood. 6 decades from his death, Wright worshipers from around the globe come to this bluffed and still rural and sweetly rolling neck of southwestern Wisconsin to wonder at the thing he made, rebuilt and rebuilt again. Yes, I am already nodding toward a 4-letter word, the leitmotif of this story, fire. A blunt fact. So much of Frank Lloyd Wright's history was attended by the Gothic and the tragic, encircled by it, pursued by it. No one has ever quite been able to explain this. He was an artist, arguably one of America's 4 or 5 greatest artists ever, who spent a lifetime conceiving sublime spaces for our aesthetic contemplation, but who lived a life largely of seeming Old Testament disaster and disarray, enough of it of his own making. If harmony and order were his great artistic ideals, he could never find, or seldom find, little of them in his own debt-plagued, scandal-racked, death-haunted history. In a way, it's the oldest artist story there is, except in this case, the story seems multiplied exponentially. For a cluster of reasons, and not without recognition of the risks, I chose, therefore, to start the story, or my Wright story, right there, or right here, at Taliesin, with a deep look at the most savage and iconic moment in the incredibly myth-laden life. Some of you know instantly what I am referring to. That inferno midday, August 15th, 1914, when the greatest architect this country has yet produced suffered a personal catastrophe that would have destroyed a man of lesser will and lesser ego, although maybe that is just saying the same thing twice. When a black employee in a white serving tunic, supposedly getting ready to ladle out the soup, went berserk with a shingling hatchet and ropes of gasoline splashed beneath the door jambs. In 12 or 14 minutes of blurring chaos, small and quiet-seeming Julian Carlton, about whom history is still confounded, managed to murder or fatally wound 7 people, one of whom, perhaps the first of whom, was the 45-year-old woman whom Wright deeply loved and had been living with indecently, the word is in quotes, for the past several years, even as his own decent and deeply denying wife down in the serene Chicago suburb of Oak Park kept praying he would somehow come to his moral senses and return to his family. The attacker split her head nearly in two with one rounding swing. Her first name was Mama. Once she had been his client and near neighbor in Oak Park. 5 years before, these two lovers abandoned their family to go away to Europe together, and ever since had been living in a kind of flouting sin. Again, that word in quotes. That's the way the world had it. That's the way the pulpits wished it. Wright wasn't home that noonday. He had left for Chicago 4 days earlier, intending to be back on the weekend. If the slayer had had his way, there would have been no survivors and nothing to be back to. As much as this moment has been chronicled, pored over, dreamed into by what is now 3 generations of Wright biographers and historians, dreamed into by playwrights, by newspaper feature writers, by documentary filmmakers, by a handful of novelists, by conspiracy theorists, there is still so much about it that has to be imagined, conjured, which is to say, we know so much and simultaneously so little, which in a way is its own definition of Frank Lloyd Wright himself. Riddles wrapped up inside of riddles, triangles drawn inside of circles, drawn inside of squares. But wait a minute. Who was Julian Carlton? What I discovered is that this century and more, the figure at the center of August 15th, 1914, had remained a kind of cipher, almost a cartoon of madness. It's as if we always had the deed and none of the life. History has had a hard time just getting his name straight. And here I have to bring up an old legend from the Washington Post. Shirley Povich, his son Maury Povich, has a history with this house. Shirley Povich was a walking legend at the Washington Post. And do you know what he used to tell his new hires in the sports department? He said, "If you go, it'll happen." Perhaps without fully realizing, I was also being pushed forward by something Wright himself once said, namely, I believe that in the search for the answer lies the answer. So I went. So I searched, and yes, some of it happened. And here is but one thing I found. The slayer was never from Barbados or any other Caribbean place, as has been passed along in uncounted books and uncounted acres of newspaper feature stories. He, in fact, was from backwoods Alabama, one of at least 13 children with parents who may have been born into slavery. It is not an inconsequential fact. Okay, I suppose I'm now egging you, and not so slyly, to pick up the book, even if eventually only from Van Pelt. I will say this much. The mysteries of Julian Carlton, with their outward spreading concentric circles, refracted back powerfully on Frank Lloyd Wright himself. A life inscribed, circumscribed by race, fire, murder, loss, regret, concealed haunt, and all of it somehow inseparable from his artistic genius. From the outset of this search, I was determined to try to knock back what I believe is a wrong-headed misperception, namely that the stainless steel armature of Frank Lloyd Wright's ego and arrogance allowed him to ride through the world for nearly a century without pain or remorse and with little compulsion to ever look back, unlike Lot's wife in the Bible. I simply don't believe this. The late teacher, critic, historian, Vincent Scully of Yale, whom I am in awe of, both as a writer and historian, he once said lyrically, I think of him always as the great American confidence man who's changing the world according to his own images, who's wearing many disguises all the time. He's right out of Mark Twain. He's right out of Melville. He's the man, you know, in his rebuilt Lincoln Continental, in which he has taken out the rear window because he says, I never look behind. But in this, respectfully, I say Professor Scully is flat wrong. Wright was always looking behind, however surreptitiously. There's too much evidence otherwise. It's there at the margins. It's ghosting at the edges, sometimes not ghosting at all. It's in the narrows, hiding in the blue channels of the impossibly swirled life. This is especially true at the back of his life. The comments he made, the odd things he did, the places he seemed to be seeking out, some of which had to do with his long-dead father, about whom he had told the greatest single lie of his life. But really, the phenomenon I'm speaking of, this sense of uneasy conscience, this unrecognized capacity for regret and sorrow, this awareness of self-inflicted wounds, it's present from the beginning, too, and in the middle, if you just know how to look and where to start listening. Listening. In my own life, there is much that is complex. It is difficult for me to square my life with myself, and I cannot until it is done or I am dead, he said in a letter to a patron in 1908. 3 decades later, in a letter to that patron's widow, he said, I only wish I had been less taking and more giving. But character is fate, and mine got me into heavy going and no safe harbor yet in sight. Another letter, listening. Ugly things happen. I've said the best and the worst of everything came to me. In the days after August 15th, 1914, when his back and neck were sprouting with hideous boils, when he couldn't sleep or eat, and he was rising in a little back room in the saved part of Taliesin to take ice baths and go out on the hills in the moonlight or to gallop across the valleys on his horse, this prideful man said to his baby sister, you know, you told me once when I was reaching so high that someday I would pull something down that would destroy me. A quarter of a century later, in 1938, quote, I have found that when a scheme develops beyond a normal pitch of excellence, the hand of fate strikes it down. The Japanese made a suspicion of the circumstance. Purposely, they leave some imperfection somewhere to appease the jealousy of the gods. I neglected that precaution. 10 years before that, on December 5th, 1928, from another letter, I have met with terrible misfortunes and accidents. There is a good deal of sadness back of all of the bravado, and though you may not know it, I too have fought a good fight. Well, you get the idea. Remorse, much less shame, much less secret haunting. These are not ideas we associate with Frank Lloyd Wright. But what if our ideas are wrong, have long been wrong, or at least not wholly correct? I suppose I don't really have another name for the thing I am trying to get at, except the word humanity. The problem is, when you are a writer in search of that humanity, wish to make a case for it, you have to be willing to keep kicking away all the dross and refuse of a life. Well, that is the book I have tried to write. And in getting my pages here, I realized that I have screwed up one page, so I'm going to read just this is part of what I would say in the text anyway. Oh yes, fire itself. If Frank Lloyd Wright has seemed to resist true explanation by his uncounted chronicles, probably all for the better, and including the person standing in front of you who hasn't figured it out, this much can be said: he lived his preposterous life in a kind of beautiful rage, and flames ran through it. I have spoken here briefly only of just this iconic event on August 15th, 1914, but it is a fact that fire, like biblical rain, came down on this man in one form of destruction or another, not just then, 1914, but 1925, 1927, 1929, 1932, 1937, 1952, 1954. Even after he was dead, it was as if fire wouldn't leave him alone. In the early 60s, there were 3 fires in a row at Taliesin West in Arizona. What explains all that? I don't have the answer. That's God's truth, God's answer. I was once having that conversation at Taliesin West in Arizona with one of his old apprentices, a man named Arnold Roy, who had come as a 19-year-old from Boston and had gotten mesmerized, and who was now past 80 and suffering his various ills. He had kindly hobbled out of his room into the fire-like heat of an Arizona noon to make time to meet. He was seated at lunch with other old apprentices and current staff and architectural fellows. When the subject of fire came up, something flint-struck. It was as if 6 or 7 decades of his life had just been lopped off. Frank Lloyd Wright attracted fire, he said, leaning across the table. Pause, beat, almost a fiery gleam. And then I suppose the next question is why? But he just let it hang in the tinderbox desert May midday air. Thank you. So damnedest thing, I had that last page typed out because it was just a little shorter than what's in the text, and I lost it, but I'll find it when we get home tonight. Even though I started, Al, about 10 or 15 after, I think we have time for questions. There's an audience plant. Where is she? My dear wife. Perfect.
I am the plant, yes. Here's my question. I think I've asked this before, but I'll ask it for this audience tonight. Why Frank Lloyd Wright?
What a great question. Zach, are you there, Zach?
You need a particular slide?
Yeah, we need a particular image. Where did old Zach go?
Leah can do it.
We're going to go backwards. Oh, man. Right there. Keep going back. Right here. Right. Can we pause? This is why Frank Lloyd Wright. That's my boyhood, Frank Lloyd Wright. That is in Kankakee, Illinois. I grew up on the same street as that house. We lived 5 blocks north where the middle class and barely middle class folk lived. Our family rented a house for $75, but down at the river were the rich folks lived. And at the very bottom of the river was this house and the one next door to it, which was also a Wright, a little less grand. In 1953, I was 9 years old, and under the Christmas tree was a spanking new J.C. Higgins maroon 3-speed. J.C. Higgins was the great Sears Roebuck bicycle. So when spring came to Kankakee, I was sailing down South Harrison Avenue. I must have seen this house before, but now on my bike, on my wheels, I was on the way to the ballpark with my Spalding ball glove hooked to the handlebars. And out of the corner of my eye is this house that had just seemed to come down from Mars. It vaguely repelled me, beckoned me, fascinated me. This house is in every Wright book there is. It's a very, very famous house. What this house is, it's the same, and Professor Brownlee and Larry Silvers would know tons about this. This is the St. John the Baptist house. This is the precursor house. This is the prairie that is not quite the prairie. This is just before the clock strikes midnight. After this house, which is 1900, come all the great prairie houses of Frank Lloyd Wright's next 8, 9, 10, 12 years, but he runs away with Mama in 1909. But this house is 1900. It's why it is such a seminal house. And no photograph can catch the incredible, stretched out breadth of this house. Why? He's replicating the American prairie. This is manifest destiny, going from east to west, going from one shore to the Pacific Ocean. That's what this house is, and yet he doesn't quite have it all the way, because if this is a prairie house representing that great stretch out of American democratic values, what is this great vertical peak doing here in the middle? He was still working it out. I think to look at this house the first time is to feel a sense of a man's interior torment. There was a review in the Wall Street Journal, and it quoted that line and said, and I had said in the text, maybe even the person gazing at it. I'm not even sure in 1953 I had ever known the name Frank Lloyd Wright, but something got into my imagination, something got into my consciousness, and because I'm a very slow learner, it only took 6.5 decades for it to loop around and find me as a writing project, but by damn it did. Thank you for that incredibly intelligent question, Seal Hendrickson. My old student, Jeffrey Barg, who knows a lot about landscape architecture. And after studying creative writing and other things at Penn as an undergraduate, we took these courses together. I always like to say we take them together because the kids teach me as much as I, quote, teach them. Jeff went to the School of Design here and got a degree in
city planning.
There you go.
There I go.
So what is your question?
My question is, speaking of photographs, all of your former students, and I'm sure many others in this room, have heard you talk at length about how photographs inspire your writing and your books. Were there any particular photographs that galvanized you in this one?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There's not too many photographs in this book. I wanted to make it a word book. There are exactly 24 images. There is one photograph starting out each chapter, and then in just a few chapters, some interior photographs. Gosh, I'm terrified that we would get into this because it's so difficult to explain, but Al made a reference. Tulsa, Oklahoma. He did, in fact, build a home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but the grossly misnamed Tulsa race riot, it really was the Tulsa Race Massacre, occurred in 1921. Frank Lloyd Wright that's in this story. I made 5 reporting trips over 3 years. The photograph that heads that chapter, Jeffrey, is of a man, Frank Lloyd Wright's first cousin, who was so key to this very complicated story. That photograph, once I began to peer into it and try to peel it back, was a seminal photograph. But there are some photographs here and this little slideshow is of most of the images in the book. There are a couple of his father that haunt me deeply, that I tried to do exactly what we always did in telling stories out of photographs. You just put your jeweler's loop on it and go all the way down, drilling down and trying to read that photograph. My writing students are so sick of hearing this, but I contend that you can read a photograph in the way that you can read Emily Dickinson, or you can read Proust if you look closely enough. Not that I've ever read Proust. Another question, please. Anybody? Good old Dave Espy. friend and pal.
I'm glad you mentioned that line about Jesus early in the book, because that made me start writing. You said Wright may have resembled him in one way, but one way only. And then later in the book, Jesus pops up once more when the investigative reporter and former seminary say, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."
Yeah.
Isn't there a lot of...
The last word in the book is Amen. I'm quoting. The book is dedicated to a guy named. I want you to continue with that question. Dedicated to the cultural historian of the city of Chicago, who became my godfather. His name is Tim Samuelson, and he took me under his wing in this book. But he wrote a particularly eloquent email, which I end. Al was talking about the source notes. I mean, all kinds of things that I could not shoehorn into the text. They're in the book, within the book, in the essay on sources. But on the last page of who will ever find this? On page 572 or something, I quote this eloquent email from Tim Samuelson, and then I simply make a new paragraph, and I say the word Amen. And I told Al, I think I've always wanted to end a book on the word Amen. But Dave, your question.
I mean, aren't there a lot of similarities? I mean, you have these two characters with incredible hubris, self-belief, myth makers, mysteries, people who've written about them and claimed things, and
Absolutely.
there's a lot.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to push this too far, but I did say in my notes of introduction, I don't particularly think of myself as a religious person anymore. Somehow, I'm almost feeling more spiritual. I'm a refugee, actually, from the Catholic Church, but I have found a little building out on the main line where I go and sit in the shafts of silence. I haven't gotten my nerve up to attend a service there yet, but I go in the afternoons and sit there. So when I say I feel on our best days of what we do in here, we're being maybe a tiny bit priestly with a small p. So Dave, without pushing a point, you have been a friend and a reader of all my books. I remember when I first came to Penn, riding that train up one day a week in 1998. The book about McNamara and Vietnam had just been out a year and a half, and you had read that book. And I remember in the hallway you said you were going pow, pow, pow to that guy, Paul. So I so deeply appreciate that you have read my books, and I would plead guilty to the idea that probably in all of them are embedded two words: the word search and the word spiritual. Just trying to be very quiet about that. Miss Elaine, who came down from New York, right, in all this bad weather. Elaine, like Jeffrey, like Susie Cook here and others, just a beloved old student from how many years ago? 15?
I think it was 11.
11.
I graduated in 07.
I never forget their faces. I never forget their pieces, and I cannot get straight who they were exactly in class with or what year they graduated. But I could rattle off a couple of Elaine's pieces. Yes, ma'am, your question.
Okay, so my question, I want you to take us into a little bit of a backstage glimpse. All the people you interviewed, all the different places you traveled for this book, was there one defining moment that sticks out? It could be something that didn't even make it into the book. Just something that really was memorable to you, and why?
I will tell you a story. This came up last Wednesday evening in the Roby House in Hyde Park in the University of Chicago. That is this little jewel is a Usonian. We went on from my boyhood out. So the B. Harley Bradley was that house in 1900 on the river in Kankakee. That's a grand house, immense, a monster. This little jewel here is 1,500 square feet on the corner of, I'm going to answer your question, kid, on the corner of Birch and Tepfer in Madison, Wisconsin. Seal has been going with me on these trips, thank God. She's a retired nurse of 45 years. She keeps me stable and sane. She has never seen this house. We want to drive by it at night when this pumpkin gleam is coming out. Is that an amazing little building? The man who lives in it, who's a retired art professor from University of Wisconsin at Madison, a man named Jim Dennis, he said it's like living inside a well-made guitar. You feel it could, you could nest it in your palm, and there's no foundation, there's no basement. How has it withstood all these Wisconsin winters? It's sitting on sand. The historians have that wrong. They think gravel, but it's sand. But here's a moment that came up at the Roby last Wednesday night. The Roby is sort of the apotheosis Prairie House, 1908. He's fleeing everything. He's trying to escape his life. It was actually finished after he had fled to Europe with Mae McChaney, his lover, who had her head split in two, literally in two, said the newspapers, with a shingling hatchet. In the Roby last Wednesday night, a man asked a question similar to yours. Was there a defining moment? That event last Wednesday night was not what I have just been doing here, boring you with my too screechy voice. That was a conversation, Q&A, with Tim Samuelson, the man to whom this book is dedicated. And somebody from the audience said, was there a defining moment? And I turned to Tim and I said, I wonder if you remember this, Tim, but about 4 or 5 years ago, I was having a severe moment of crisis, among many crises, whether I could keep on with this book. And here is why. I began to feel that I disliked him more than I liked him. For me, I am not fueled by my indignation. I think of Robert Caro. I think he's fueled by his indignation in his Lyndon Johnson biographies. David Halberstam, who's a great mentor and friend of mine, been dead now since 2007. He was always fueled by his indignation at the terrible follies of Vietnam. What I find is I have to find some quotient of liking that is greater than the disliking. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I began to panic that this man's ego and arrogance was driving me away and that I would not be able to finish. So one day we were at lunch. If I've had one conversation with Tim Samuelson, the cultural historian of the city of Chicago, I've had 100. And I almost grabbed him by the lapels, except he never wears lapels. He wears baggy old sweaters. I said, Tim, I'm just, promise me, Tim, tell me that he's not a shit. And Samuelson put a big grin on his face and he said, Paul, I do not choose shits for my heroes. And that was a kind of crossing over moment, Elaine, that relaxed me psychologically. I guessed that I could go ahead and finish. That's one defining moment. There were so many. How are we doing?
We're good. We got 10 more minutes.
Oh, wow. I'll be so tired.
Greg Janickian is next, then Kitsy.
Kitsy and Greg, or Lisa.
So, Paul, after Hemingway's Boat, which was a wonderful book, I remember asking you.
I know what's coming.
I remember asking you, well, Paul, what are you working on now? What are you going to do? Oh, he said, I'm so tired. I'm going to write a book about Frank Lloyd Wright. But, he said, it's going to be very short. And I said to Paul, that's good. That's good.
That's good.
That's
yeah.
good. Seal will be very happy.
So here we are at 600 pages with those last 60 pages of the essay on sources in very small type. So Greg has reminded me this many times. Yes.
So you did know that you were going to write a longish book, I think. Did you not?
I don't know, Greg. Is it just my simple narcissism or ego that I feel I have that much to say? Or is it that here's what I am. I am not an architectural historian or critic like some of the gentlemen sitting here in this room tonight for whom I have undying respect. What I am What I am is a narrative nonfiction writer who gets obsessively hooked into projects. And once you get obsessively hooked into projects, one question leads to 5 more, and 5 more lead to 25 more. And Ben Bradley, the great old editor of the Washington Post, said once that all it takes to be a great reporter is just an unquenchable curiosity and good legs. I have something of that, I think, of the curiosity. And when my legs began to give out on daily journalism, I was walking up the walk with you, and you told me about falling deeply into America. And I had the gleam that I might fall deeply into the University of Pennsylvania. I get obsessively hooked into them, and one story, and this is not, Greg, I don't know how to do those. This is a non-linear book. This kind of swings on one rope in the jungle to the next, and somehow or other tries to achieve a gathering momentum. I don't know how to do cradle to grave biographies, but they do seem to take me the mystical 6 or 7 years, and this is the longest book. And damn, if I dare try another one, if I have my wife's permission, I'm saying it in front of the assembled tonight. It'll be a short book. Kitsy.
Paul, I'm wondering, when you're doing the enormous research that you're doing, I wondered if there was a point, I imagine there were a number of points, but a point where what you learned stopped you in your tracks. I mean, where you just had to turn around your own assumption or expectation.
Yeah, there were a bunch of those. And we will stop here very shortly because I am going to give out, and maybe there will be a few books to sign. I feel it's trying to push the boulder uphill with your nose when you are trying to use the H word for Frank Lloyd Wright, that is the humanity word. But it's one thing that knocked me flat was his longing for his father, about whom he told the greatest lie of his life. And that lie was that his father had walked off, deserted the family, and left them all bereft in spiritual and literal poverty, when the truth was exactly opposite. The world had pretty much known that for a good while. I feel that I spent more time on his father in 2 long chapters toward the end of the book than other historians and chroniclers have. One of the things that knocked me flat, Kitsy, was when I discovered at the Avery Art and Architectural Library at Columbia, which is just a world-class repository, his Sunday fellowship talks. Here's what they were. He was the son of, he goes all the way back to preachers. His father, his grandfather, especially on his maternal side, they go back to Wales as preachers and makers of hats. So he would give these Sunday morning fellowship talks, and if in essence they were off the cuff, spontaneous sermons. If you get the transcripts, they have, by and large, not been studied by historians. And if you listen to the audio tapes and you hear what's beneath the language, you begin to hear the cues. That's why I say hiding in plain sight, ghosting at the edges, and sometimes not ghosting at all. This deep longing for his father, whom he effectively murdered for posterity by writing into his autobiography implicitly, never actually saying it, but you cannot fail to get the impression that his father walked off and left him. It was exactly the opposite. His mother drove his father off. The family broke up in 1885. He was a teenager. He was 18, almost 19. And he was haunted by that for the rest of his life. That was one of the things that stopped me in my tracks. Many others. But
We have time for one more question. Walter.
Walter Licht.
Can you speak to the issue of race in Frank Lloyd Wright? Obviously, there's an African-American killer here, and then he gets involved with Julius Rosenwald. And
As a last question, it's so complex, Walter, but... yeah.
So anyway, speak about race in Frank Lloyd Wright.
the first sentence, the first sentence of a nearly 20,000 word chapter. It's entitled "The Man on the Station Platform," and that man is not Frank Lloyd Wright, it's his first cousin who baited the Tulsa race riot into being. The first sentence of that long chapter is, "We are speaking now of the Tulsa race riot of 1921. Yes, something that sounds absurdly far afield and isn't." I'm egging you to buy the book because it is so complicated. Julian Carlton, this man who did this incredible thing while Wright was away in Chicago working on a project called Midway Gardens on August 15th, 1914. If you go home and Google his name, what'll pop up? Maybe in a year from now, with the little inroads this book has been making, Google will change. But what will pop up in your first or second entry is Julian Carlton, a Barbadian Negro. In fact, those were the first 7 words in the Chicago Tribune the next morning, which was August 16th, 1914, a Sunday morning. A Barbados Negro yesterday with a hand axe. They used hand axe in 2 words. He wasn't. He was from our own country. And that becomes a deeply resonant fact. My search for that and how that hooks into the Tulsa race riot, because his first cousin, Richard Lloyd Jones, we're not talking about guilt by association here. Why is Wright implicated to some degree? His first cousin in 1921 was the editor of the Tulsa newspaper and baited that event into being. But in 1914, 7 years before, he was not in Oklahoma, he was in Wisconsin. He was the editor of the Madison newspaper, the Wisconsin State Journal, and was the first one to report this terrible event. He had compartmentalized into his head the idea of the good Negro and the bad N-word. And obviously, I won't say it. That wouldn't play in the liberal confines of Madison, but as soon as he got to Oklahoma, he could say it right out. The good Negroes and the bad N-word, and this puffed up event, this fake event that supposedly happened down in Tulsa in 1921. The editor is fanning the flames. All these years later, when you begin, not only in those fellowship talks, but see other things in Wright's writing, he is quietly wondering, or at least I'm asking the question, to what degree is he quietly haunted, or not so quietly, about all this? And getting back to Dave Espy and the religious aspect, Wright was wondering, I believe, about the chain of moral consequences. Namely, does 1909, running away with another man's wife, who's your client, leaving your children and your wife at home, does 1909 in some way lead to 1914, and does 1914 lead to 1921? And when you put his father into the mix, all of this begins, I contend, and I'm not just up there in the ethereal air making these suppositions, I'm using text to fortify what I believe, and it's much too complicated to further explain it here. But at one point, Dave Espy, I raised this with a Wright scholar in Wisconsin. Does 1909 somehow lead to 1914, and does 1914 lead to 1921? And his father, and this guy, friend of mine, Wright scholar, he said, pretty Catholic, pretty Faulknerian. I have done an inadequate job at answering your question, but I promise you, Walter, that the fact that Julian Carlton was from not Barbados, but from Chambers County, Alabama, with a mother and father who had been born into slavery, one of 13 or 15 children, is not an inconsequential fact. And man, am I tired.
Paul Hendrickson, everybody. Paul Hendrickson. The book is Plagued by Fire. We're selling it for, what did I say, 25? Paul will stay up here for a little bit to inscribe your copies, and then he will drift into the reception, but you can still get him to inscribe copies. We have a yummy, big-time Writer's House reception for you. Please stay and enjoy yourself. And one more time, let's thank Paul Hendrickson for a remarkable program.